Why should we not lay up treasures on this
Bring
earth?
all the tithe to the storehouse.
For we brought nothing into the world, and it is certain that we can carry nothing out. No one can serve two masters. Honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first fruits. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. He who loves silver will not be satisfied. Earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, even the people. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Hello and welcome to Faith and Finance. The program today we're going to be talking about training children, money in marriage, and money in singles. Whether you're young or old, rich or poor, married or single, we all have to manage money. So we're going to talk about how to make this a simple plan in our lives. What I'll show you is that many of you will be using the book Faith and Finance that we've recommended. There's a chapter on this particular topic. We also have it in Spanish, Fe y Finanzas. If this is your first time viewing the program, you'll know these are available when you see the 800 number on your screen. There's also a reference that I want you to remember. It's Philippians, the 4th chapter, and verses 11 to 13. And I'm going to read it. In fact, we encourage you to memorize these. So this one would be Philippians, and it's the 4th chapter, verses 11 to 13. And this was a well-known passage in the Bible, as you know. Not that I speak in regard to need, Paul says, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. Contentment is a very, very strong theme in the Bible, especially in Paul's writings. I know how to be abased. I know how to be abound. Everywhere and in all things I've learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Nevertheless, you have done well that you shared in my distress. In other words, someone helps him. And verse 13 again, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. We're going to look at the idea of managing from a biblical perspective. God's ideal family is a man and a woman who have married and left their parents to establish their own household. Obviously, there are others today because when sin entered the world, the family structure took on a very different form due to death and divorce. It's important, of course, that we understand that the Bible and God recognizes even singles as a family. Both husband and wife should develop a budget together. However, the one who works well with numbers and who is the most willing should be the one who is the manager. By the way, that person is typically the most frugal one as well. So we want to understand that. The family unit is very, very important. There has been some discussion in politics recently about taking a village to train children and so on, but really the basic building block of all society is the family. For example, if all of our families were trained to be true and honest and hard workers and debt-free, then the whole country would be debt-free. The well-being of society and the success of our churches and the prosperity of our nation depend on the home influences. So what your family is, if you can encourage others to follow along that, it will be a general great benefit. So we want to look at some guidelines for training children. When we study the principles for the family, we learn that the location of the home is very important as well. In fact, you can consider in the Bible the example of Lot, who was Abraham's nephew. The story is actually told in the 12th and 13th chapters and on into 14th chapter of the book of Genesis. But we understand that it's a very amazing thing that Lot actually wanted to move his family into a city thinking that he would benefit them. But the corrupting influences about him had an opposite effect on his children, and they connected, obviously, in many ways with the inhabitants of Sodom and bound up his interests with theirs, and the result is before us. We know what happened there, a very, very sad situation. So when you establish your family and set up your household, the very first thing I believe would be the moral and religious influences that will surround our families. Those who secure for their children a worldly wealth and honor at the expense of their eternal interests will find that in the end these advantages are really a terrible loss. It would be better for us, of course, to have God's constant witness of the creative power about us. You understand in the Bible that when Proverbs, the 3rd chapter, verse 10, talks about God blessing all the work of your hands, that your vats will be filled with new wine and your property will prosper and so on. The idea is it's much better to raise children in an influence that's less artificial and man-made. For example, more of a country setting if possible. I know we don't live in an ideal world, but if we did live in an ideal world, we would not be raising our children in the midst of gangs and violence and the problems of big cities, pollution, corruption, and so on. In fact, the idea is even something very simple like having enough place to have a garden can teach children about the value of cooperating with God when they plant the seed and water and let God's sun come along and warm the earth and to bring it to fruition and so on. Watching those things is a very great advantage for children, as we all know. The Bible says that children should be instructed throughout the day. In fact, Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter, verses 6 and 7, talks about it in a very nice way. I want to read it from my Bible because this is the New King James, and it says it in a very nice way. And this will be the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy. Remember, this is Moses' last sermons to Israel, and he's talking about how parents should train their children. The New Testament talks about training them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. But here in Deuteronomy, it talks about when they should be taught. So if we bring children into the world, we should be responsible for teaching them to be good citizens, to follow God, and to manage their money and so on. So here in the 6th chapter, verses 6 and 7, these are the words which I command you today, and they shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. So 4 times a day, children should be educated to be good citizens and to follow the nurture and admonition of the Lord. When they get up in the morning, when they go to bed at night, when they're sitting down for meals, for example, and when they're walking with them in the way or when they're traveling. These are important considerations, and I think that if parents would follow this and recognize their responsibility, it would be a very, very wise thing to do. Children should be taught to manage money when they're very young. And one of the ways they can do that is by their parents providing them an allowance. When I was young, my father did not think anybody should get an allowance, that nobody should ever get work for anything they didn't work for. And I think that every child should have a part in the family, like making their beds and dumping the trash and feeding the pets and doing, simple yard work and that kind of thing. But before they're old enough to work, I actually recommend that parents give their children an allowance. It doesn't have to be much. It could be so much a week, $3, $4, $5 a week or something, but then they can learn to figure their own tithe and offerings and their own savings and their own spending money. We actually provided our children with little banks, and we had on there, one is God's money, one is my money, one is for savings and so on. And these are the things that will help them to learn while they're young how to manage money. We teach our children to read and to write and to do mathematics or reading, writing, arithmetic when they're very young. Many children now, even before they start first grade, know how to read. But we're also suggesting that they learn to have their own accounts, and they can go forward, advancing step by step with this knowledge. Now, I want to tell you something about help for college expenses. As a matter of fact, this is one of the most difficult areas that people face in their lives. And I think that children should learn to work and be taught to work so they can learn lessons of responsibility and promptness, being on time for their appointments, punctuality, and so on. Children can help you with work projects around the house, and also you can teach them character-building stories as you're working with them and as you talk with them at time for bed. Now, there are a number of things that I can tell you that children, young people can do as far as planning for college is concerned. And by the way, I will tell you that many financial counselors, including myself, would recommend, rather than putting a whole bunch of money away in a bank for saving for college, it would be much wiser. The Wall Street Journal talked about this, Bottom Line Personal has mentioned it also, and that is if parents, while their children are young, would use their extra money to pay off their home mortgage and have it completely paid off by the time the children go to college, they can use the money they were using for home mortgage payments to help their children through school. Then they would be in a secure position in home ownership, and the students wouldn't have to get student loans. But there are grants and scholarships available, and part of that is on the responsibility of the young people themselves, and that is if they do good academically while in high school or academy, and they also get involved in leadership activities like editor of the yearbook or class president or something like that. These things are generally acknowledged as worthy of scholarships by college presidents and various colleges, and students can get scholarships. Obviously, you don't have to pay those back. There's another one, and that was just plain old work. Look for work opportunities and work in the summer and work a little bit during the school year, those kinds of things also. But I think parents owe their children an education. And I'll give you my reasoning for that. In the Bible, it was very interesting to understand that parents would give their children land. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And most of them were farmers, so they could make a living on the land. But most of our children are not farmers today. So if we want to provide for them, we need to make sure they get a good education. Now, taking out a student loan should be your last resort. So I want to talk to you some about student loans. Apply for grants and scholarships that you qualify for. You don't have to pay these back, and no interest accrues on them. As a general rule, when we talk about student loans, getting a college degree will enhance your income capability for the rest of your life. If you don't have the money to finish your education, it might be appropriate to get a student loan, but only after you've considered these points that I will tell you. I think they're very important. First of all, getting a loan is fairly easy, but paying it back with interest is the hard part. In other words, it's not just free, you have to pay it back with interest. The second one, most government-backed student loans cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. The only way to get out from under a student loan like that is to repay the loan or die. So you understand you've got that. A number of years ago, right after the Vietnam War, for example, when there were a lot of young people wanting to get into college, there was an interesting thing happened, and that is students who didn't have the money would get student loans, and the day of graduation, they may have, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 of student loans. They file for bankruptcy protection and walk away from it with their degree and no debt. So the government, of course, closed that loophole, and now if you have a government-backed student loan, you cannot discharge it in bankruptcy. You must remember that. Make sure that the education you're funding with the student loan will lead to a job, a better job than you now have, and with higher income. Because there's no point in borrowing money unless you're going to have enough income to justify paying it back. Of course, I've mentioned this just briefly, but apply for all the grants and scholarships that you qualify for, because you don't have to pay these back. It's interesting also, I believe that parents should help their children with their educational costs. And if you're a parent, I can tell you, don't just say, well, go off and work, I worked, and so on. In Bible times, as I mentioned, parents gave their children land as an inheritance. Most of our kids are not farmers. I have 2 children, neither one are farmers, and so we have helped them with their education, and I certainly recognize that that is something very, very valuable. The primary goal of parenting is to train their children to become independent adults. Now, you can work and save in the summers and work part-time in the school year as a student, and this will, of course, minimize the amount that you have to borrow, if any. The work experience that you have in summer work and school work also will help you to have some experience that employers are typically wanting to know, what experience do you have? And that's something that you can then say you have. Now, if after doing all I've just told you, work all you can, get your parents to help all you can, make sure that your education is going to provide you with additional income and so on, and you don't have enough money to finish your degree, don't borrow all you qualify for. Do you understand what I mean by that? Here's an example. If you go to the student aid office at school, you have to fill out the application and so on, and typically for young students they'll say you have to give us the copy of your parents' 1040 IRS form for the past 2 years and so on. You submit all this stuff, and then you have to wait about 10 days, and finally you get a call on your cell phone or a text message that says, come by the office, we have news for you. So you go by there and they say, good news, you qualify for $10,000. Well, what if you could actually get through that school year with only $2,500? How much should you borrow? Only the $2,500, because you have to pay it back with interest, and you can't discharge it in bankruptcy. This is very, very important. But guess what most students do? they borrow the whole thing. And then there's a big burden. I would also tell you, if you're a young person and you're thinking about marrying someone, instead of finding out what their sign is, ask them what their student loan level is, because when you marry that person, you just inherited that debt. And this is important for you to know going in. It doesn't mean you wouldn't marry someone in debt, but it does mean that you know what's going on. I've talked to many people who've been so disgruntled to marry someone. This is typically midlife marriages or second marriages, when they find that the spouse they married that seems so affluent is deeply in debt. So you want to make sure that that doesn't happen for you. Since we don't live in an ideal world, there may be times when it's necessary to borrow. But just make sure that when you do borrow, that you borrow the very minimum you need, and then plan to pay it off as quickly as possible to save on interest costs. I'll give you an idea. Banks and lending institutions, if you're a good credit risk, would like to loan to you for as long as possible to make extra interest. For example, look in the Sunday paper and you'll see cars advertised $2.99 a month. And in some ads, it won't even tell you what the total cost is. It just says $2.99 a month. And you look at your budget and you think, well, I can afford that. What they don't tell you is that that's for 6 years. And you know, all the interest that you pay over all of that time. And this is very important. I want to talk to you a little bit about the credit dilemma that we face in America today. It just happens that the misuse of credit cards through cash advances, splurge spending, carryover balances, and spending beyond the credit limit are really what makes the credit card companies rich. They really don't mind to charge you an extra fee for late payment or something. But let me just tell you some of the dangers of credit card spending. The first, they encourage spending which compound your debt, making it harder to keep track of multiple cards. For example, if you have 10 cards, you get 10 bills in the mail every month. And how do you juggle those? Most people would be better off without store brand credit cards. By that I mean, a Macy's or a Sears or whatever. Choose a simple card like MasterCard or Visa, which are accepted at most establishments, and the interest rate on those is typically negotiable, unlike that of store brand cards. And so to avoid paying interest, pay off your balance every month. Just a little aside, studies now show that even people who pay their cards off every month, actually spend more than they would using a credit card than they would if they paid cash every month. So it's important that we understand that. Another thing we should likely address is the habit of getting cash advances from ATM machines. There's a number of reasons why this is a problem. One is that some companies or some banks actually charge you fees for that, which are substantial compared to the amount you take out. In addition, it encourages people to spend more, which they typically do. And when you spend cash, there's not a lot of records for it, as you understand. But in addition, of course, you have to make sure that you're safe where you do it, lots of things like that. So you'd be better off just using a debit card or a credit card, not a store brand, as I mentioned earlier. The Bible talks a lot about being content. We read one of those verses at the beginning, but 1 Timothy, the 3rd chapter, know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. And the first two things, remember there's a long list of awful things that people do, brutal and so on, but the first two things are lovers of themselves, which would be selfishness, and lovers of money. And we're told in the 6th chapter, 1 Timothy, godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain that we can carry nothing out. So if we have food and clothing, with these we should be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and to many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. That's 1 Timothy 6, verses 8 and 9. So we're also told that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, which some have even strayed from their faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. One big question that comes up is, how much is enough? Frequently, people think, well, if I just made a little more money, great for me. How much is enough? Well, I'm going to give you an illustration so you can answer that. whatever you have, if you're content and willing to live there, if you want more, get a better education, go back to school. Many of us have gone back to school, even in midlife, and I will just tell you, then you can have a solid base upon which to build your personal family finance. I was working in India for a couple of weeks, doing a series of meetings there, and the pastor who I worked with had a congregation of maybe 400 members. Of his entire church, only one person owned an automobile. And this man had a Jeep that he used for a taxi. So the pastor asked me one day while we were visiting, by the way, he didn't have a car. He had a bicycle that some rich American had provided for him. That's from his perspective. And then he was so thrilled that he could ride a bike between his churches. But he asked me, do you own an automobile? And I really was quite embarrassed to tell him, yes, I actually have two of them, one for me and one for my wife. So you understand what he thought about me. The real interesting part about this is how much is enough? And the real question is, there has to be a limit of what we spend. No one can answer that question for us because it is really so personal. By the way, self-denial, which is the hardest sermon to preach and the most difficult to practice, will help us to have contentment, but it doesn't come naturally. It has to be learned and it has to be practiced. So most people can get by on a lot less if they're willing to do that. King Solomon recognized our tendency to be discontented, and he prayed an interesting prayer. It's recorded in Proverbs chapter 30, verses 8 and 9. He says, "Remove falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches, but feed me with the food allotted me, lest I be full and deny you and say, 'Who is the Lord?' or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of the Lord." What about our homes? Well, this is kind of an interesting situation to think about. We're going to have a whole program on buying houses and cars and how to make major purchases, but I'll give you this little advice here. We're counseled that we should have a single family home. The Bible says when a man gets married, he leaves his father and mother and establishes his own place. How would you describe an ideal house? Well, we'll talk about that in the other one, but typically it should be a single family dwelling with one unit of family in it, and probably a place where they can have a garden and so on. What about a place for families to learn together? That's what homes should be like. Children can learn to return tithes and offerings to God with the counsel of their parents and their example, of course. Children can learn about responsibility and cleanliness by keeping their rooms tidy and helping about the house and so on. The home is also a place for families to learn together about finances by opening a checking account for the children through, small jobs assigned to them. Children can learn the importance of quality items that endure and hold their value. An interesting life experience for our family is that when our son, who's the oldest of our two children, was 10 years old, my wife took him to the bank to open a checking account because she had read in the paper that the bank was offering free checking to students. The banks were probably thinking when they placed this ad for high school and college students, but Andrew was a student. After all, he was in the 3rd grade. So Kathy took him to the bank and he opened his checking account. And from then on, he had his own checking account and he put his allowance in there and money that he earned and gift money. And we actually gave him his tuition money so he would write his check for his tuition. 3 years later, when our daughter was old enough to, when she was 10 years old, my wife asked her, "Melissa, would you like a party this year? Who would you like to come?" And she says, no, I'm not interested in a party. I want to go to the bank and open a checking account like Andrew did. So it's really important for kids to learn. They think of themselves of growing up when they have these experiences as well. We also know that in every home there should be a self-denial box. This is some counsel that I learned, and I thought it's very, very valuable. And children and the whole family can put money in there that they would spend on unnecessary stuff. Expensive things, drinks or candy or eating out or whatever, put money in there. And they should be used, that money, on a regular basis to use for helping others, paying down the debt on the home. All family can work together. On the local church if there's a debt. By the way, we get interest deduction for interest that we pay on our home mortgages. That's the only interest that's still tax deductible, as you know. But who gets any benefit if your church is in debt? If you will help the church to become debt-free, think of how great that would be. Another one is a reason for saving self-denial is the supporting the mission of the church. That is an outreach for helping missionaries or helping someone to go on a mission trip, even your own family going on a mission trip. If you ever think you're poor or have difficulties, take your family on a mission trip to a poor country, and they will recognize how blessed they really are. A third reason for having a self-denial box is to help the family to stay out of debt. Now, it's very, very interesting that people think, especially young people, that when you just whip out your card and use it, that they think it's free. But you have to actually have them come together when it's bill paying time and say, remember when we bought these tennis shoes or sneakers or whatever they are at the store? Well, now we have to pay for them, and here's the bill in the mail. That's an important one. Another one that we can do when we save in self-denial is to help the poor. Now, we're talking about family management, not just budgeting, but one of the things you can do is have a self-denial box where we actually help the poor. It's interesting that in every city there are people, almost every city in America, where there are homeless people today. Young people can be involved in, helping to support a soup kitchen or to make sandwiches or to buy things to help the poor. As a matter of fact, the Bible upholds helping the poor as one of the major things that families can do to grow character, to make real quality. In fact, Jesus says when he comes back, he's going to ask us, this is recorded in Matthew 25, where were you when I needed help in the person of the poor and the suffering? The last one that I'll mention here about why we would have a self-denial box is because in every family at some time emergencies come along. And we can teach our children that if we have an emergency fund, if they have a savings account, when something big comes up that they would like to purchase, or if there's some kind of an emergency, there's an accident or an item like a bicycle is damaged in some way, then you can have the money to go forward with it in that way. Whether we're single or married, whether we're rich or poor, and whether we're involved in any aspect of life, we have to manage. Some people make so much money they don't really have to manage, but somebody has to manage for them if they don't. But for most of us, having a simple spending plan and living within that plan and training our children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord can be a great blessing. And I would certainly encourage you to do that. It may seem like a chore or stressful at first to get on a budget. Remember that it's not going to be easy, but we have a program and there's a whole chapter in the book about developing a spending plan. If you do that, you'll be much more free. There'll be less stress in your life, and I think that you're going to be in a position for God to bless you. And eventually, when He returns, you'll hear the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your Lord."